In this video, we'll discuss Virginia Held's article, Non-Contractual Society, a Feminist View. Held has had a long and productive career and is the author of many works on topics in ethics and feminism. In this piece, she's going to argue that the practice of mothering is a better model for social relations in general than is the paradigm of the economic man, who operates exclusively in terms of voluntary contracts. Now, let me explain a little bit more about what Held has in mind by this model of economic man that she's against. This is the picture of human beings that is presupposed by classical liberalism and free market economics. So on this picture, liberty is essential to human beings. Humans own themselves. They are autonomous. That is, they are fully self-determined, and nobody has a right to coerce them to do anything that they haven't voluntarily agreed to do. So, for example, John Stuart Mill has the harm principle, and according to the harm principle, the only justification for interfering with anybody else's liberty is self-defense. That is a classic expression of the kind of liberty principle at the heart of contractual thinking. Another key value on this picture of human beings is equality, the idea that by nature, everyone has the same rights. And the idea is that each person naturally pursues only his or her own interests. So people are free, they're equal, they are egoistic, that is, they pursue their own self-interests, and they relate to each other through voluntary contracts. People only give up their rights or take on obligations through voluntary agreements. And people are rational. They only enter into such contracts when those are in their own perceived interests. So this is the picture of economic man. It's the picture that people have, or opponents have, when they think about how humans can and should relate to each other. And several of our modern social and political institutions seem to presuppose this view of economic man. For example, social contract theories of government. Now, according to these social contract theories, and I'm thinking of the tradition that goes back through Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, even Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, according to these, this family of views, individuals agree with one another to surrender some of their autonomy, some of their rights of self-determination to the state, to the government, in exchange for certain protections. And that's that's what legitimizes the government and its special powers and sovereignty. Democracy. Democracy is, in one sense, government through voluntary agreement. And democracy embodies equal rights of participation for all members of the society. And then the whole idea of private property in a free markets, in other words, of capitalism. This is the idea that all and only voluntary property transactions are just and fair. These ways of relating to each other in society, which are very familiar and actually fundamental to our modern world, seem to presuppose this view of economic man as a rational, autonomous, self-interested agent who only relates to others through voluntary agreements. But Held wants to radically question and critique these contractualist social arrangements and the picture of human beings that these arrangements are based on. So the mothering person is Held's alternative paradigm member of society. She wants to put the mothering person in place of the so-called economic man and try to think about what society would look like if we thought of humans in these terms. Now, she doesn't give us a strict definition of what a mothering person is, but the reason she uses that expression is that she says that the mothering person can be male or female. So she's not merely thinking of a biological mother, but a person who fills a kind of role. And although she doesn't exactly define the practice of mothering, she seems to have in mind the relations that is between children and mothering persons. Specifically, she has in mind the relation between children and mothering persons without the patriarch. Now, what does patriarch mean? Well, the first part, patri, that refers to a father figure. But arch, the etymology means it's the ruler. So she wants to think about the relationship that mothering persons would have to children if you didn't have an authoritative, dominant father figure in the picture. So that's what she has in mind by the practice of mothering. Now, there's a lot of questions we could ask about this, but I won't ask them right now. So historically, women have been largely confined to the domestic sphere and child rearing, according to Held. And that's a domain in an activity that supposedly lies outside of the contractual domain. It's in the marketplace, that is, in business and in commerce, and in the government, where contractualism has had the greatest influence. Proponents of contractualist ways of thinking have in effect designated politics and business as the truly human spheres, essentially. On the other hand, women in their work of bearing and raising children were allegedly more natural and instinctive than they were rational, more animalistic than distinctively human. And so women have been excluded from the sphere of contractualism, from the spheres where contractualism dominates, and they've been regarded as, relatedly, as almost subhuman, or at least the practice of mothering, according to Held. Now, Held completely rejects this view of mothering. She says that human mothering is totally different than merely animal mothering. Human mothering creates new persons, not just animals. That is, new moral agents and bearers of rights. Human mothering involves linguistic, moral, and cultural development, not merely biological development governed by instinct. So human mothering is essentially and distinctively human and shouldn't be disregarded, therefore, as a model for human social relations. Now, many feminists have imported liberal principles, that is, these principles associated with economic man and contractualist society, these values of freedom and equality and democracy and voluntary agreements. Many feminists have imported those principles into the family, into the domestic sphere, and insisted upon equality in the family between man and woman, have insisted upon the autonomy of women, even in the family, have insisted that everything should be done only by voluntary agreement in the family, and so forth. Many feminists have done that. And Held isn't against the gains that she sees as having been made through that. But her approach here is very different. She is interested in exporting household principles, the principles of mothering, out into the broader social sphere that's been typically dominated by contractualism. She wants to explore, therefore, the differences between mothering and contractualism. And she wants to suggest that in many ways, mothering is a superior paradigm for society at large. So let's explore these differences as she sees them. There's 6 of them. First of all, when it comes to the subject of voluntariness, mothers cannot choose their children. Now, she sees that ideally, she thinks mothers should be able to choose when they bear children or if they bear children. However, even if you can choose that, you can't choose which child you have. And on the other side, children can never choose their parents in any respect, or even whether they're going to have parents or be born. So that's not voluntary. Furthermore, there's no kind of deal happening here. There's no kind of reciprocation in this relationship like there is in the marketplace when you buy and sell things. Typically, mothering is an activity which is not motivated by the expectation of a reward at all. It's not being done out of payoff. Now, maybe there actually is a payoff. Maybe your kids take care of you when you get old, but typically that's not why parents and do what they do. In fact, they hope that their kids won't have to be burdened with taking care of them in old age very often. So the voluntariness feature is very different in the mothering relation. Secondly, permanence and non-replaceability. Now, in the marketplace, if I buy a soft drink and I accidentally drop it on the way out of the store and it explodes or I spill it, I can walk right back in the store and buy another one that's exactly like it. Or if you damage my car in some way, well, you can reimburse me with money and for the value of the vehicle. There's none of the items are permanent and they're all replaceable and they're all at least through money. And the same is true in the political sphere. If your favorite candidate, something happens to them, well, you can get another one from the same party with pretty similar ideas real quick. However, unlike commodities and unlike politicians, mothers and children cannot be replaced by others of equivalent value. Human beings don't work like that. You can't just like, oh, well, something happened to my child, I can replace that child. Even if you're going to have another child, you can't replace a child that's been lost. And the same is true of mothers. These relationships, furthermore, are permanent and are of permanent significance and permanent impact on our lives. So they're very different than the marketplace and the polis and like commodities and politicians. Equality. The mother-child relation, according to Held, involves equal respect and equal consideration for the mothering person and the child. But she says it does not involve their having equal rights. The mother has the right to rule and the child doesn't. And that's the way it ought to be. Majority votes are not usually advisable in a family situation where the children outrank or outnumber the adults. The interest of a mother and child should not be weighed against each other. Furthermore, it's not even quite accurate to say that, well, the interest of the mother and child person count equally, as if they could be pitted against each other and one has to be sacrificed to the other sometimes, and they take turns, and the child's interest is sacrificed into the mother. That's not even the way we think about a healthy family relationship. They're not pitted against each other. Rather, the one mutual shared interest of all parties is the flourishing of shared mutual affection, bonds of trust and hope. Those are the common interests of both. And she thinks society could gain a lot from that. And societies too, to focus only on contractual relations. What's in it for me? My rationally pursuing my own self-interest, egoistically, the gains and losses of individuals. That kind of way of thinking obscures often many more important relational aspects. Fourth, non-interference. Non-interference does not fulfill the obligations that a mothering person has to their child. If you have a small child, you better interfere with their lives and interfere with their autonomous personal decisions, or otherwise they'll destroy themselves. They'll be sticking their fingers in sockets and hurting themselves. And if you let them eat whatever they want, they'll die of malnutrition. So she says, non-interference is not a value. The harm principle is not true and does not apply in the mother-child relation. Rather, on the contractual model, by contrast, leaving other people alone and not violating their autonomy is all that you owe them. She says that doesn't work in the family, and we ought to reconsider it, even in the sphere of government and in the marketplace as well. She says and here's how this would work. What this implies is that other people have moral rights to what they need to live, and we ought to give it to them. In other words, just like your child has a moral right for you to not merely not interfere, but to provide them sustenance, so do many grown people who are needy. They have a right to what they need to live, and you ought to give it to them. So we should think more in those terms, she says, in broader society. Privacy. The mother-child relation begins not with privacy, but with an all-enveloping social relationship. I mean, think about the dependency and the relationship of a newborn to a mother. It's 24/7. Privacy is something that is only gradually established. The contractual model imagines that individuals somehow start out life all alone in the state of nature, and then they get together and through voluntary relationships and decide, okay, I guess we'll relate to each other in this way. That's a unreal picture in the domestic sphere, and she says we should reconsider it also in the broader sphere. And then finally, power. The mother-child relation involves very unequal power. But in this case, now often the unequal power is a threat to liberty. It's a threat to people's rights. It is an invitation to oppression. But that's not the case in the mothering relation. The more powerful party, the mother, does not seek to dominate, but to empower the weaker party for responsible action. The mother's power lies precisely in her vulnerability to the child's needs and pains. The child's power lies in his ability to call forth the mother's tenderness and care. So the power is indistinguishably related to vulnerability and mutual dependence. On the contractual model, power is always dangerous. Asymmetrical power is used for oppression. Big difference here. Now, what are the takeaway points? Well, she wants to say that, look, the contractual model based on the economic picture of man, that might be appropriate or helpful for thinking about the marketplace and the legal and political domain, at least parts of it. Maybe, she says. But she says it is not an adequate model for thinking about morality or for other social relations. When we think about our place in society more broadly, about how we get along with our neighbors, we shouldn't think in terms of the contractual model. The mothering person and mother-child relation is a far better and more fundamental model for how we all think about getting along with each other and relating to each other. What do you think? What would be the implications for rethinking and reworking our social institutions, our relations to our neighbors and coworkers, based upon the paradigm of the mother-child relation? What would be different and would it work? Think about it.